Okay, got it. Okay. Okay, thanks everybody for coming. As we kind of go through Cassandra's talk, you can put any questions you have in chat, or you can wait till afterwards and ask them or whatever, and we'll get to them as they come up. Just as a way of introduction, Sherry and I went to Churchill in mid-November last year. It's kind of a place I kind of wanted to go to, and even as a kid. So it was pretty awesome to go, and it certainly exceeded all our expectations as far as seeing bears and seeing the Arctic and all that kind of stuff. And so that part of the trip was awesome. The one thing that really resounded with us was this whole issue of climate change, and you can really notice it in the Arctic. I think things are happening there a lot faster than they are happening even here. And I think the one day we were there in mid-November, it was actually colder on Protection Island than it was in Churchill. So obviously some issues of concern there. The one really cool thing though that's going on up there that is the amount of research into climate change, into animals and ecosystems and everything, and that's where we met Cassandra. So she graciously offered to do a talk and share some information with everyone here. And so just by way of introduction, Cassandra is currently completing her PhD in biological sciences at University of Manitoba. Is focusing on ring seal diet in Hudson's Bay. I think she'll talk quite a bit about that, but sounded like looking at seals was quite a challenging thing to do. So previously, Cassandra completed research measuring polar bear body conditions using photographs with a nonprofit organization, Polar Bears International, a really cool organization in Churchill. And Cassandra's continued working with Polar Bears International in varying capacities relating to environmental education to promote polar bear conservation. Super interesting person to listen to. So I think given that, I'll just turn it over to you, Cassandra, and let you go.
Okay, well, thank you very much for hosting me virtually, and thank you for that introduction. So I'm Cassandra, and I've been working in Churchill in a variety of different ways since 2011. So it's actually been quite a long time. I actually originally started with studying lemmings, so the small rodent, and then from there went to a huge jump to polar bears, and then I'm following a much more natural progression down the food chain, and I'm focusing most of my PhD research on seals. But for both polar bears and seals, they're heavily connected to one another and closely tied to the sea ice. And so as Rick was mentioning, this past fall, I was working up in Churchill with Polar Bears International doing outreach, and I'll talk a little bit about some of that nonprofit organization's mission and some of their goals. And it was really one of those years that it could help us communicate a little bit more about climate change and the changes that are happening in the Arctic. The Arctic is warming 2 times faster than most other places on the planet. And for places like Churchill that are really on that Arctic, subarctic line, it's not truly the Arctic ecosystem. It's actually quite interesting that we have parts of the tundra ecosystem, we have the marine ecosystem, we also have boreal forest, and it's really sitting right on that line of that subarctic. And so we're seeing change much more rapidly in that area than in some of the other places in the Canadian Arctic or the Arctic as the whole. And this past fall, as Rick was mentioning, it was very unique where we didn't see the ice form until quite late in November. If we rewind 2 years ago, so in 2020, I was also up in Churchill for a brief period of time, and the bay froze around like Remembrance Day. It was much earlier. And so what we're also seeing with climate change, particularly in terms of tracking ice formation and when it melts, is we're seeing so much variability from year to year. And for species like polar bears and seals that are so connected to that habitat, we're seeing a lot of different changes, not only in their body conditions, but then their diet. Researchers are also looking at contaminant loads or their stress or different hormone cycles. For me, I've really focused in on fat, polar bear and seal fat specifically. So I'm going to share a little bit about how I got so connected with Polar Bears International, and that really leads to somehow my slides aren't advancing. Oh, there we go. One of the programs that they have is they have this ambassador program. And so in 2011, 2012, 13, 14, I was going up to Churchill, and I was going on the tundra vehicles that Rick was mentioning, that you can go and see polar bears safely. They have this incredible ambassador program where zoo professionals and graduate students go up to help give a little bit more information to either research that's happening in captivity or research that graduate students like myself are doing in the Arctic. For me, as an ambassador at the time, I was actually completing my research from the tundra vehicles, equipped with a camera, and you might not be able to make it out, but there's these two laser that we had on parallel to the camera. And the idea was, we know that there's lots of people going to Churchill, they're taking cameras with them. Let's use something with those photos. Let's turn those photos into data. And so we needed a way to standardize those photographs. We tried this parallel laser idea. Spoiler, it really didn't work. They got too cold, and I would tape heat packs to them, and it still wouldn't really work. And then the other thing was, some people started noticing, they're like, there's green dots on the bear. And I wasn't harming the bears in any way, but they were just inconsistent. So then we turned to what I'm holding here is a laser rangefinder. So you can point it at any object up to 500 meters away, and it will tell you the distance. And so that was the key piece of information I needed to help standardize my camera's exposure, the lens, and all that, to then turn the pixels in the picture into measurements of centimeters so that we could get an idea of how fat the bears were. And it was a really good opportunity as well for me and for other graduate students and even undergraduate students to go and start trialing this new method so that we could establish a way to not invasively measure body condition. Bears have been very well researched in Churchill. It's very accessible. It's in northern Manitoba, and so it's a 2-hour flight from here. I'm in Winnipeg. I'm born and raised. So even though it's remote, it's quite accessible in terms of how we can get to places in the Arctic. Go ahead.
I don't think your slides are advancing, Cassandra. We're still looking at the first picture here.
I'll reshare. Can you see this? Okay, so did you see this one before? No, okay, I'm sorry. So in this, I'll just quickly show, in this photo on the left, this contraption is the one that had the camera with the parallel lasers. And then this photo on the right is the laser rangefinder. And we could relate all the polar bear body, what we could visually just see and guesstimate in a way using a standardized fatness index card, which I'll show you in a little bit more detail. It's probably something that you might be familiar with if you've taken your dog or the cat to the vet, where you can get a visual assessment, kind of a qualitative idea of the overall fatness on the body. And so I'd collect photos like this, and we compared it to some photos from early 80s when some professional photographers were like the only ones really going to Churchill. And now we have so many folks from all over the world going to Churchill. And so it was just this way for us to turn some of these photographs and that you're going to take home and have these lasting memories, but actually helping us determine a way to measure body condition non-invasively. And not that it's great to have research in Churchill. We have other ways of looking at body condition. So really when wildlife handlers or managers are going to handle the bears, they're going to get so much more information. It's kind of like a big vet checkup. But in some places in the Arctic, it's just not feasible for us to handle bears the way that we've been able to in Churchill or some of the lower areas of the Arctic. So having a photographic way of looking at condition and having it documented is something that we were hoping to achieve. And by using captive bears in zoos, and we were able to then standardize some of those techniques so that we can take those pixels from a picture that you're seeing here and actually get an idea of how long or how tall that bear was. And then we could also measure their belly and their butt to get an idea of how much fat's on the body. And so this is that standardized fatness index card that we use on the buggies even today. So often in the fall, when most people are going to Churchill to see polar bears, we're looking at bears as they're getting to some of their smallest body size. They eat a lot in March, April, May. And then when they're forced ashore, like the bears in Hudson Bay are, because it's a seasonal sea ice regime where it will grow and completely melt in 1 year, forces the bears ashore, and then they're fasting. They might get something here or there, but it's not going to actually contribute to their overall condition. They might get a little bit of minerals, but they're not getting a lot of nutrition. And so when we're using these cards, we always want to like make sure that we're using photos from the same time of year, and also just acknowledge that when we see some bears, yeah, we see some that are thin. We really want to avoid seeing bears that are super skinny, and we definitely would want to avoid seeing bears during skinny, thin, if they're just coming off the ice. And so we can use this visual assessment to get an idea of how well their hunting was going, and then also things that they might have, how much they were eating when they were on the sea ice, because that contributes to their overall appearance. And so I would take these measurements, as I've mentioned, particularly lines G and F are the ones that we focused on trying to determine their condition, and we could use that going forward to measure. We could also highlight or measure their body length in 2 different ways. And we're still refining the best approach to get an accurate measure of body condition. But what we do know is using the bears in zoos, particularly the ones here in Assiniboine Park Zoo in Winnipeg, we've been able to validate the technique. So it's something that we can use in other areas, even if we can't handle the bears. And so the idea behind this project is really thinking about, okay, the chain of change. And so we've mentioned already that, yes, there's a warming climate, and that leads to a reduction in sea ice. And particularly for bears in Churchill, that's important because, as I mentioned, it's that seasonal sea ice regime where they're forced ashore for periods of time every year. And that's always been the case there, but they've relied on having that sea ice season to be as long as possible so that they can have access to their food. So that reduction of the sea ice actually gives decreased opportunities for them to hunt their primary prey. Ring seals are the primary portion of polar bear diet, and to a lesser extent, bearded seals. They're a little bit bigger, I should say a lot bigger, particularly if it's a male. So often we see bearded seals in the diet of adult polar bears, just because a young polar bear learning to hunt is probably not going to be as successful. But polar bears also eat things like beluga or the bowhead whale and narwhal. And so those are other foraging opportunities that they can have when they're on the sea ice. When they're off the sea ice, they're not having access to these primary marine prey, which is where they're really getting their fat. And so those decreased opportunities then leads to less body fat that they put on their body. And for polar bears, having a large tummy and a large bum is a good thing because it's storage of all that energy that they can use when they are on shore fasting. And that's what leads to that lower body condition. So as they use the energy that they've stored in their body fat, they're going to have poorer body condition or more skinny, thin appearances. And that also tells us that don't have stored energy on their body. And for females, this is really important because they need to have a lot of excess energy stored in their body, not just to go through an extra long fast, because females in Churchill, currently, if we were in Churchill, the only bears on land right now would be females that have just given birth to their cubs. For ease, we kind of just say on New Year's is when all the polar bears give birth, because it's somewhere in that period. And so the cubs are really, really young right now, and they're feeding on mom's milk. She hasn't eaten since last June. That's when they came off the sea ice in Churchill. And so she's not only fasting still, but she's also feeding her cubs really, really rich milk. It's about 38% fat. And she'll be doing so until March. And then she'll hopefully this March get back out onto the sea ice, be able to get a meal, still will continue to nurse those cubs for the first year and a half of their life. So this leads to decreased reproduction if they don't have that body fat to sustain themselves, particularly those females, because it will lead to cub survival just not working out, or maybe they won't even go through pregnancy. They have what's called delayed implantation. And so when the females go into the den in September, their body has decided there's enough fat, we can sustain the pregnancy or two, maybe there's 2 embryos, but they won't implant until she's in that den. And that way, if she did not have enough body fat, the body will forego the pregnancy, and it will give her a chance to then get back out onto the sea ice, hopefully mate again and be fatter next year. And then of course, as math goes, if we're not going to be reproducing, we're going to see an overall population decline. And the Western Hudson Bay subpopulation, there's 19 subpopulations of polar bears. They are delineated that way for management reasons. They don't really stick to the certain lines, but they do have high site fidelity. So Churchill bears often come back to Churchill because that's where they were born. And that population is one of the southernmost populations, and it's declined by about 30% in the last 2 decades. And on average, we say that bears are now spending approximately 1 day longer each day on land than 2 generations of polar bears ago. And so this population decline, of course, is something that there's all these different research questions that can come into this chain of change. But I just want to link it back up to this warming climate and the sea ice. And the sea ice is really what's central to the story for any Arctic researcher. It doesn't matter what you're studying or who you're studying. We're often talking about sea ice dynamics in one way or the other. And so this is not Churchill. This is actually completely on the other side of the globe, but still the Arctic. This is an archipelago of Svalbard. And the lines are just showing you their seal tracks. And so I'm starting to shift a little bit to understand polar bears. We have to think about seals. And of course, it all comes back to the sea ice. But in Svalbard, what they've been able to look at is that seals are traveling farther now. And they're traveling farther because the sea ice extent is declining. And so seals, not only to get their food, because they also eat a lot of things that are tied to sea ice, and I'll get to that in a moment, they have to swim further. And so for seals, then they're using a lot more energy to get some energy. And so that's something that is concerning, of course, because if we think about it, and this was my natural progression of thoughts as well, it's like, okay, well, if polar bear, if their conditions declining a little bit, what's happening to their prey? Are seals as nutritionally valuable for them now? Are seals also thinner? What are seals eating? Because the seal really is that link between those marine animals and polar bears, which are a marine predator because they're so tied to sea ice, but they're still somewhat terrestrial. They're not really a marine mammal in the water, but they are classified as one. And so thinking about how marine mammals have to get their food too, and if they're traveling further, that led me to have a lot of questions about, okay, well, what are seals eating? And how do the seals in Hudson Bay get their food, and how do they travel? So this is the food web, simple, or it's kind of a schematic that's been simplified in a way. And of course, really what I'm going to hopefully convince you of, that seals are just so integral to it. Many call them a keystone predator because they are very important for shifting any energy up to a polar bear. They're also very important for many Canadian communities, Inuit communities, for subsistence harvest, for dog food, for clothing, and cultural practices. So there's a lot of research too in that I could go on all day about, but I'm not involved with, but in terms of seal health and the contaminants and things like that. For me, I've always been, as I've mentioned, interested in fat. So looking at how much fat's on a polar bear and then relating it to, well, okay, well, how many seals are they eating and how fat are those seals and how did those seals get fat? And so this is the Arctic food web. And as much as like I joke all the time that I keep having more questions, then the natural progression for me at probably at the end of the talk, you'll probably think of this too, is, well, what's happening with the fish? I have decided I'm not moving further down. I like mammals, but there are a lot of fish ecologists too that are concerned with fish diet. And if we think back to like how seals in Svalbard, Norway had to swim further to the ice edge, what we know about Hudson Bay is that these really important Arctic cod, lots of lipid in their body, have moved northward. We don't find Arctic cod as frequently or as in the numbers that we used to in Hudson Bay. They've shifted northward following the sea ice extent. And so to understand seal diet, I work as a graduate student here at the University of Manitoba, but also with fisheries and oceans. And they have long been sending what we call these sample kits to communities across the Canadian Arctic. For me, I'm really focusing on Hudson Bay. And so Churchill is right here, if you can see my mouse, kind of on this little spit of land, northern Manitoba. If we go 300 kilometers north, then we're up into Nunavut. And Arviat's one of the places that we've been collecting samples with Inuit hunters for over 20 years. Same with Sanakilowak, which is in eastern Hudson Bay and a little further south. So these are my two areas that I've been looking at seal diet, trying to relate it back to, well, what is available for the bears that we see in Churchill? What are the food items of the bears eating, and how can we study that? So we use these sample kits. The sample kits get sent up and the hunters will send us small pieces of tissue back to us, and we're able to use those tissues for a variety of analyses, things like contaminants. We can look at hormone levels. For me, I've focused on how much fat's in the tissues, and which is lipid, and then specifically what kind of signatures might be in that lipid and what we call diet markers. And I've been able to determine diet that way. And so here are the certain tissues that are important for studying diet. And this would be applicable for polar bears as well. Usually we can get a fat sample when we capture or handle a polar bear. And then in other cases, we can get more samples like fur and muscle and things like that in other ways. But for a seal, we'll get things like their blubber. And so their blubber, this is an image that I inverted from the lab. This is their fat, and it can be up to 6, sometimes 7 centimeters thick, and it's just chock full of lipids, which is the polar bear's favorite food. They love this, and I've always joked that I work in a freezer that has like the smorgasbord for a polar bear. And this represents about 3 months of their diet. It's approximately an average. So we can get a pretty good sense of what seals have been eating over the last 3 months. We also get liver, which we can use something called stable isotopes, so carbon and nitrogen, and I'll talk a little bit about that. That shows us about a month of their diet. And so it's a shorter time frame. Those tissues, they just turn over faster. And then for a longer picture, we use muscle, and that is about 6 months of their diet. And same thing, we can get stable isotopes from this, so carbon and nitrogen. And this really tells us who the seal is eating and approximately where. With fatty acids, we can get a really distinct picture of what kinds of lipids are in their blubber and how energy rich they are. And also, we can use their whiskers to get an idea of a very short time frame. So we collected these whiskers from seals that we captured, and we were able to cut up the the whiskers into these small segments so that we could get these weekly snapshots of diet of each individual, and then look at, are all the individuals doing the same thing or not? And so I mentioned this a little bit, but just to take us back to the food web, because the food web really is where it's all at in understanding polar bear seal dynamics in relation to their sea ice environment. But we have these Arctic cod, very endemic to the Arctic. And as I've mentioned, their range has shifted northwards because Hudson Bay is too warm. So we're seeing this increase of sand lance and capelin, which are also a small forage fish kind of in the middle of this food web. But what I want you to think about is they don't have as much lipid in their body as Arctic cod do. And that's really been a big piece of us trying to understand, okay, well, how does that impact ring seal body condition? And then how, of course, does that impact polar bear body condition? So that they're not as lipid rich, but they're in Hudson Bay in large amount of numbers. So again, thinking about your foraging behavior, like that cost benefit analysis of, if you were a seal, are you going to go try to get the really energy rich fish? You might have to spend a lot of energy to get there, or are you just going to eat a lot of these subarctic fish, or some even more temperate things like smelt are also in Hudson Bay. And we've never studied seal diet in Hudson Bay. So these were some of the founding information that we had to begin with and to work off of. And then having all of these tissues, we were able to get some ideas of what seals are eating in Hudson Bay. And for me, I've always translated that back then to polar bears and what does that mean for the polar bears that we see in Churchill. And so we captured these seals in Santa Kilowak. I'm going to just tell you a little story about these ones, because we are able to look at their weekly diet, which I think is really interesting to think about how their diet might change over the time of the year, and then also thinking about when bears might be eating them. And so in Santa Kilowak, this is in eastern Hudson Bay, we captured 41 individuals over a 6-year time period. And we put satellite tags onto them. And so I have a satellite tag at home, and I've shown this to students before, and they're like, you just happen to have this sitting at home. Even my husband sometimes is like, why do we have this? But it's useful because then when I get asked to do things like this, I can show you. They're not very heavy. They're very similar technology to what we put on polar bears on their radio collars so that we can see where they're moving. So the battery pack's all in here, and this is the antenna that would speak to the satellites. And we just glue it. We just glue it onto the seals, and we hope that it stays on. It's a pretty strong glue. Seals molt in the spring. So April, May is typically when this would fall off. So we put this on at the end of the summer, hoping to get a big picture data of where seals are swimming and moving around in Hudson Bay. And I know that there's some researchers actually out west that are looking not only at the seal satellite tag data, but they're correlating that too with where bears are moving and trying to figure out hunting ranges and some overlap in some of those spatial analyses, which is pretty cool, but a little outside of some of my knowledge. And again, I'm very interested in how big they are and what they're eating. Knowing that it's more than just that is, I think, really important to always keep in mind. So with these whiskers, we would get that snapshot of and then this is also just us putting a satellite tracker, gluing it onto that seal, but we get this snapshot of about a week of diet. And so like I mentioned, here's a schematic of what that whisker looks like. We chopped it up into all these little pieces, and then I was able to do my stable isotopes on it, looking at carbon and nitrogen to see what the seals were eating, and to see if they were consistently eating the same thing. And also, are they eating the exact same thing as another seal of the same age, or even a seal that's younger than them? So we really were able to get a lot of information on what seals are doing in Hudson Bay. We say that polar bears are hard to study, and it's totally true. For me, even when I was taking photos of them, they needed to be in a particular spot. They, as Rick probably can tell you too, they never really truly cooperate. They do what they want to do. They're wild animals. Polar bears are difficult to study. Seals are even harder because they're in the water and we don't see them. And so having these kinds of research abilities or ways that we can get information has been incredibly useful for our understanding of the system. So I'm going to walk you through this mess because this is all of my data. And when I first saw it, I was like, oh my gosh. So remember that for each individual that we captured, we were able to get multiple data points for every individual. And so every single color that you're seeing on the screen is a different seal. And you can hopefully already pick out that there's some seals that really did lots of different things. And then I put them into different categories just based on the age and the sex of each seal. And so just to walk you through this diagram, we use this stable isotope carbon. So these are ratios of the isotope for carbon, and we also use nitrogen. So carbon tells us where in the water the seal's eating. Is it eating at the surface? Is it eating kind of in the middle of the pelagic zone? Is it eating really close to shore or more in a coastal area? Or is it eating in the benthic area? And nitrogen tells us where on the food chain they're eating. So if they're eating something that's a producer or a primary producer, you're going to have a much lower nitrogen value than if you're eating all meat or you're eating a carnivore. So if you're like a secondary predator, you're going to have a much higher nitrogen value. And so that can be helpful for us to kind of get an idea of how food webs are connected and exactly what seals might be eating. And so again, this is just representing our trophic level and where in that water column. So we really can see where seals are eating because we might not get to watch them eat. And in fact, I don't think any of us have ever really seen that because they're consuming everything within the water column itself. And so in order to do this, in these colors now what I put on the screen are different prey items that we think that seals could eat. So we have things like themisto. They look like small little zooplankton, little shrimp. Gammarids are like another little shrimp that they can actually be quite large, but they're found at the bottom. That's why, or the benthic area. And then we have capelin and sandlance, those two really abundant new fish in Hudson Bay over the last about 10 years. And then cod and sculpin. And so we also have to collect those signatures of those animals to get an idea of what the seals could be eating in order to understand, okay, well, if a seal's eat somewhere, so if a seal's eating somewhere, they get a signature here, I would guess, okay, they're probably eating some sandlance and they're probably also eating some themisto. And we have some statistical models that can do that for me because I'm not the greatest at math, but I can use the software. And so that's what those circles represent, is really just if a seal's right in the middle here, that tells us, okay, they're eating a lot of sandlance. So if I put everything back on, as much as really what we see is most of the seals are eating just that. They're eating a lot of sandlance and a lot of capelin. You might be noticing this blue individual. This is an adult female. Don't really know what she's eating. She's eating something because she's getting something into her tissues, but we haven't quite figured out what she's been eating, but she's moved around a lot. So she's not just eating the same thing over and over again. Very similar to this green male. I'm just going to show you an animation of this whisker represents about a year of that seal's diet, moved around in this space in that he was eating a lot of capelin and then moved down to like maybe this squid or other large invertebrate area, changing up their diet strategy, maybe just eating whatever they can come across. Whereas this other male in gray up here, if you can see, over the year, because having so many different segments of their whisker, we were able to determine this over the year, stayed relatively with like all the signatures were very similar. So that told us that that individual was really specializing on these cod and sculpin. And I will say that when I say cod, this isn't just Arctic cod. We also have Greenland cod and there's some evidence about Atlantic cod being in Hudson Bay, but their signatures are very similar. So I can't tease those ones apart. So when I'm saying cod, it's more likely that it's Greenland cod, not as lipid rich as that Arctic cod. They are different. And so what I want you to just take away from this is really that most seals are eating capelin and sand lance. That's why we see a lot of cluster right here in the middle, but not all seals are doing the same thing. And that's what I think is really cool. So when I separate this out by age and sex class, we look at the juveniles on the bottom. Doesn't matter if you're male or female, they're pretty much all doing the same thing. They're all learning their environment. They're probably just eating whatever they can come across and learning what tastes good and what tastes bad. Whereas in the adults, we actually start to see these distinct colors, and you can actually see the little individuals kind of cluster out from one another. And that's interesting. This goes along with a lot of things that we even know in polar bears as well. Young polar bears probably don't have really effective hunting strategies, but when they get to be about an adult, we'll start to see some level of individualization or specialization because they've had more time, they have more experience. And what I think is really interesting and what this shows us too in Hudson Bay is that seals, even though like the climate's changing and also the type of fish or invertebrates that might be in the water are changing, they're not all just fixating on the exact same prey. They do have these adaptive strategies in a way so that they're lessening the amount of competition they might have between each other. And so in this slide, I'm just going to highlight and remind us about these adult females again. We had 5. Now we're looking at the proportion of the diet, and each of these colors, and you don't have to like look at them all, represent a different prey that they were eating. But I want to highlight the blue and the purple seal. So if we're looking at the little my biplot to the top in purple, we see the greatest proportion of the diet in that individual was the sand lance. We see a lot of sand lance and we see a lot of themisto, and that's exactly what you would have probably expect just given if we just look at those purple dots. And if we compare it to the blue seal, we're also getting a lot of sand lance. We're not seeing a lot of that themisto. And so this is just giving us more evidence. We can get diet proportions, but we're also starting to get evidence of how they're doing these individual strategies. And the next step for some of my doctoral research and for other researchers that work with fisheries and oceans is then to compare the blubber, the amount of lipid that's in the blubber, and also using those fatty acids to get a better picture of the lipid content that's in the seals, and then taking that to the next level of understanding what that means for a polar bear diet, because these two seals, while they're both ring seals, they might be providing polar bears with a different amount of nutrition or amount of lipid. And that's really what we are trying to, our goal of trying to determine how ring seals and polar bears are connected within our food web. For some reason, oh, there we go. I lost my mouse for a second. So just to connect it back to that food web, when we look at this food web and we see seal, that's really simplistic because sure, they're occupying this level in the food web, but what we know in Hudson Bay and what is just, there's so much variation in what they could be eating. And the more research that we have on seal diet and looking at, okay, are more seals eating more sand lance and capelin, or are more seals eating more like things like themisto, because that's going to have an impact on the nutrition that they have for polar bears. And it all comes down to these little creatures that I just highlighted, I'm highlighting on the right. These are sea ice algae, and these are the reason we have all of these species in this food web in the Arctic. They live in the ice itself. Unlike freshwater ice, sea ice is porous. It's not completely solid. And this is important because it actually creates a wonderful habitat for these small organisms. Some of them are single-celled. So these are from a microscope from the lab. They're producing lipids. They photosynthesize just like the trees outside your home or any plant that you have inside your home. But instead of synthesizing sugars, they're actually synthesizing those lipids that fuel this entire Arctic system. And we're able to track further, and I won't go into the details today, but we're able to even look at how much of the diet is coming from sea ice algae versus things like phytoplankton, these smaller organisms that are just in the water column and are not producing the lipids the same way that the sea ice algae are, but also can produce some energy for these organisms. So even though seals and seals live under the ice, they use the ice for resting. Whenever they are resting, they're in danger because that's when polar bears are able to hunt them. Polar bears use the sea ice to move around, to find their mates, to hunt. And in some cases, they actually den on the sea ice as well. But it's really the fact that these sea ice algae live in the ice that gives us the organisms that we see in the Arctic. Polar Bears International has a saying about the sea ice is as important to the Arctic ecosystem as soil is to a forest. And without sea ice, it's more than just that platform. Sorry, it's where these small organisms are blooming in the March, April, springtime, and fueling our entire Arctic ecosystem. Lots of small copepods will eat off of those, that sea ice algae, and that's really that first link in our food chain, and it will just move up that food web that way. So I just want to say thank you, or Kwianami, particularly to the hunters and trappers organizations that I've worked very closely with for my doctoral research, and that on seals. So both in Arviat and Santa Kilowak, and I've had the pleasure of going and working with them and tasting my study species. And people always ask, well, what does it taste like? And it actually isn't that bad. They made a wonderful stew. It tastes very fishy. So if you like fish, then you probably would like seal. I often get the question, have you ever tasted polar bear? Usually is the next obvious question. I have not, but I know that some communities do eat polar bear meat as well. And I wanted to end with this video that Polar Bears International created. Again, I probably wouldn't be the Arctic researcher I am today without their support. I went up as a volunteer for them and then started doing research with them and working in Churchill. And from there, I've just always kept going back. I'm sure Rick would say the same thing. Once you've been to Churchill, it's kind of always going to be a part of you. And one of my biggest things is I always try to tell people that Churchill's a unique place and not everyone's going to get a chance to go there, but we are all connected in this natural world. And what's happening in Churchill is affecting all organisms. And again, that sea ice is really important. It's like the Earth's air conditioner, so it helps moderate our global temperatures. So I wanted to end with this video just about the organization that's really supported a lot of the work that I've done and continues to do so to this day, where we work together in, yes, I focus a little bit more on seals now, but it's for the bears. And in order to understand an organism, we definitely want to understand what they're eating and their nutrition, and that gives us a lot of insight. So hopefully this will work. Let me know if you can't hear it.
Polar Bears International is the only nonprofit solely dedicated to wild polar bear conservation. Our work is driven by passion for positive solutions.
Through our research, through our education and outreach, we have the ability to inform and inspire people on what they need to do as a society if we want to save polar bears.
Whether we are conducting our own research or funding other expert studies, at PBI we are racing to unlock a future for polar bears in the Arctic forever.
The Arctic is an extremely challenging place to work. It's remote, which makes it super expensive to do some of the science and monitoring we need to do to understand polar bears. But at PBI, we love that challenge.
Sea ice habitat over the whole Arctic has been declining by about 13% per decade. Polar bears depend on the sea ice because that's where they can catch their prey. Polar bears are good swimmers, but they can't swim as well as seals. They can only catch them from the surface of the sea ice.
Arctic sea ice is such an important ecosystem. It's not only affecting the Arctic, but it actually acts like Earth's air conditioner. So by protecting that Arctic sea ice, it's good for polar bears, but it's also good for people.
Some of the new projects we have going on, which we're really excited about, include less invasive methods of monitoring polar bears.
Non-invasive research is really important when you're looking at behavior. If we can put out equipment that does all the work, all the logging, we can remove the human element and observe that animal in its natural environment.
And that kind of information is ultimately going to be important when we're trying to understand how humans that might be occupying or exploring habitats near denning areas might influence those bears. If we understand their behavior to begin with, we can then monitor how it might change and ultimately develop ways to manage it.
We really are trying to make sure people who work, play, and live in the North have the information and tools they need to stay safe.
We've got a program here that we're piloting in Churchill, Manitoba. We're using a compact surveillance radar to alert authorities when polar bears are coming into a community long before they get to the first house or the first street.
Creative problem solving happens every day, from working with scientists to ensure that they have the equipment that they need in the field, to managing complex media and outreach schedules.
People need to know about a species in order to act on behalf of that species and protect their habitats. Polar Bears International is uniquely poised to connect people to polar bears in the Arctic. The Tender Connections program allows us to connect scientists with viewers around the globe. And the goal of outreach like this is to instill hope and inspire action in our viewers.
We have a mobile broadcast studio, and we reach out to classrooms all over the world to talk about polar bears in the western Hudson Bay. Just the other day, we had a Skype chat with an entire school in Kiev, and we got to show them their very first polar bear, and when that comes up on the screen, it's really cool.
We love going into classrooms to talk to kids about polar bears. Seeing their faces light up when we show them videos and photos and talk about our research gives us motivation to keep going and keep doing what we're doing. Our awareness campaign days, like International Polar Bear Day and Arctic Sea Ice Day and Polar Bear Week, help spread our conservation message across the globe all year long.
As humans, we have a big responsibility, not only to take care of ourselves, but to take care of all living things. Through our website and our live cams, we're able to connect people not only to the Arctic, but to polar bears. And once you look a polar bear in the eye, you'll be inspired. We need your support. Without you, we could not conduct the research and science that informs people to act on behalf of polar bears.
There's still time for hope. All too often we hear a lot of overwhelming news, particularly about the Arctic and polar bears, but we know if we take actions now, we'll see sea ice respond in kind for polar bears, and we'll also see changes that will make life better for all of us.
So one thing that I often also would like to just end with before I take all of your questions, and I was reading some of them in the chat and I'm excited to answer some of those, is that idea of like whenever we talk about sea ice decline or climate change, it often feels overwhelming. And one of the things that I think Polar Bears International has been so integral for my understanding of the Arctic is, of course, they focus almost solely on polar bears, but they do look at having researchers or other graduate students like myself that come up that focus on another species. They also work very closely with sea ice experts and climatologists. And a sea ice expert told me in Churchill once when I was kind of feeling overwhelmed, this was even 10 years or just less than 10 years ago, their modeling has shown that if we can keep the greenhouse gas emissions to what they are at now, or some of the different projections, that sea ice actually is very adaptable, like that it can respond. It's not like clear cutting a forest where it can take hundreds of years to grow that ecosystem back to what it might have once been, but we can actually see that sea ice extent as can respond and go back to what it might have been like decades ago within as little as 5 years. And so there is a lot of variability with sea ice, and that is something that we're seeing right now. Even with climate change, we can have good and bad years, and that's always going to be the case. But it's the overall trends as Dr. Steve Amstrup had said in that video, and what I mentioned earlier, that we're seeing the amount of sea ice decline, particularly in Hudson Bay, is forcing the bears on shore, typically about 1 to 2 days longer each year. And when they're on land, they're losing body fat. So I just want to say thank you to all of you, and particularly Rick, for making this happen. And I'm very glad that I could be here. And of course, with remote, the more people we can connect to the Arctic, I think the better. So I'm very honored that you asked me to be a speaker and this kick off your series this winter. So with that, I'll leave this screen up in case if there's a certain thing that I might want to go back to, but I'm happy to take questions. And I don't know if the best plan of attack or what you've done in the past is if you want me to just go through what I see in the chat right now, or if anyone wants to unmute and ask me, I'm happy to do it either way.
We can do a bit of both, Cassandra. I think if you want to go through the chat first, and then
Sure.
and then we can unmute everybody, and everybody can just throw up their hands and ask a question.
So I'm seeing a question about the ratio of males and females in Churchill, and to be honest, I don't know exactly what it is. I think it's pretty close to 50-50, but of course those things are important to track, but I don't know offhand exactly what it is. A lot of it too is kind of circumstantial, like of what bears we do catch from year to year to get those that number. For the number of polar bears that are in the research area or in the Western Hudson Bay subpopulation, that number is around 900. And again, that's representing about a 30% decline in the last 20 years. The other polar bear population that's in Hudson Bay is a little bit to the south and to the east. That's the James Bay subpopulation. That is the southernmost population. That population has also declined by, I think it's 17% over the last 20 years as well. For the weight, their males are often over 1,200 pounds, and for females, they fluctuate between I think like 800 to up to, some of them can get large to 1,200 pounds or a little bit more. And there's, I guess we could call that an average. It fluctuates throughout the year depending if when they're eating. Like I mentioned, in the fall, they're really getting to their skinniest or their lightest, you could say. When they're fasting, they're losing about 2 pounds of fat a day, or but they've estimated it to be about 1 to 2 pounds a day. And we've done that research through places in Churchill, and then also with help from captive bears in zoos as well. The 6 species that live in the Arctic. Okay, so I'm looking to another question about seal species in the Arctic. There's the harp seals. They migrate a lot. So harp seals are found in high numbers in the East Coast, not so much in the Western Arctic, but in the Eastern Canadian Arctic, there's definitely harp seals. There's hooded seals, ring seals, bearded seals, spotted and ribboned or ribbon. The other thing that I should mention too is we're seeing a lot of harbor seals in Hudson Bay, particularly around Churchill. There's researchers here that I've worked with and that have helped with my doctoral research at the, and they're also from the Assiniboine Park Zoo, that are researching the harbor seals that are in Churchill, and their numbers have been increasing, and they're more of a temperate species as well. In terms of how the sea ice affects all these seal species, it does vary. And the idea of like these harbor seals coming into the Arctic is something that maybe they do replace the ring seals, because harbor seals give birth on rocks or on land. Ring seals don't do that. Ring seals make birth layers. And so the idea of the sea ice decline, there's these questions about, well, what will happen? Will harbor seals just kind of take over, and would they be a replacement? And we're starting to learn more about harbor seals in the Canadian Arctic. Over the last 10 years, some of the research has turned, or some of our attention has turned to that. And so there's more different experiments that are being done, and we're getting more information. But for the main Arctic species, they're all tightly linked to that sea ice. So they are going to have similar altercations to their population size, or because they all have used that sea ice platform for giving birth, for nursing their pups, for molting. So molting is when they're going to completely lose all their hair, but not all at once, and they're growing new hair. And that takes a lot of energy. So they're usually out on the sea ice for a very long period of time. So some of these questions, they're questions that we have, and there's projections, but the main Arctic species are tightly linked to that sea ice. And the whiskers, somebody asked about, why do they only hold 7 days of diet information? It's similar to why the liver gives us a shorter snapshot compared to blubber and muscle. And it's something exactly how you've summarized in terms of what we call turnover, or the rate of cell division, and metabolism, and how some of this gets put into the cells in those tissues. And so for whiskers, very similar to like our hair, the rate of growth and the idea of like how the metabolism's working, so how certain those diet markers are getting put into those tissues, we think happens much quicker. Again, coming from other species of pinnipeds, not exactly the ring seal, but ones that have similar life history, where they have this big seasonality shift, we've used to get an idea of what we think that those whiskers, the rate of growth, and then that tells us, okay, that would be about a week. And so with the liver, it just also, there's so much cell turnover that it represents something that's a much shorter time frame. So for the guard hairs and the down hairs, this is always such a fun fact too. I think this is going towards polar bears. Seals have one layer of fur. They really rely on their blubber for their warmth. That it's a really good insulator, particularly when they're in water. For polar bears, of course, the fat does kind of help keep them warm, but it's really their fur. And they do have 2 layers of fur, where we have like a really fluffy, soft down type of fur, really close to the skin, tightly packed there. And then these longer guard hairs that are hollow, and they don't have a color. It's only that downy fur that's close to the skin that has the pigment. And so that's always a fun fact that I love to tell kids when I get them to ask or guess what color polar bear fur is. Some of them do know that those guard hairs, or those longer ones, they are actually transparent. We don't know why. There was a hypothesis, maybe does it pass light, and like does that help keep polar bears warm? But a physicist showed that that's not actually what's happening. And then if we think about it further, when polar bears probably need to keep the warmest, that's during the winter. Well, in the Arctic, it's dark. It's in some areas it's 24 hours darkness. So we don't know why those guard hairs are hollow. But the downy fur, or what's closer to their skin, isn't hollow. It's more similar to our hair. That's a good question, about a polar bear ever eating a seal with the tracking device. No, I don't think that's happened. It's funny that you asked this, because I think there was a paper that just got published this week about a fish that had, so a fish would have their tracking devices a little bit smaller, being consumed by a beluga, and that tracker then gave us some insight on beluga, like body temperatures, and like things that obviously happen opportunistically because the fish that had the tracker got consumed. I haven't read the entire paper yet, but I know that we don't think that it's happened with, because we would know. They probably, or if it has happened, they're not going to, a polar bear won't swallow this. Sorry, I know with my virtual background, then you can't see it. They won't swallow it. They'd probably lick it and then just leave it on the ice. and we would still get the tracker until the batteries died. But they've definitely not ingested a tracking device. But it's very funny timed that you asked that question, because this week was the first time that I think some of us have heard of us getting this information from a species that got eaten. And then we got all this other information that I guess those researchers didn't expect. Yes, a polar bear's skin is black. And sometimes like it also has like a purple hue to it. So like their tongue's purple. So all their skin's black. Again, we don't know why that they have that high skin pigmentation. Kind of still unsure for a hypothesis that's well supported for that, but they do have black skin.
Can you comment, Cassandra, sorry, about, I think one of the things that, I think it was you that was talking about it when we were up there, was that bears are one of the only animals that kind of grow as big as their habitat allows. So the bears that come back to land are significantly smaller than the bears that stay out on the ice all the time. And how much weight a bear, like, because I think it's something like when we were there, it was 150 days or something before they had been out on the ice, and how much weight some of the big males may lose.
Yeah, so when we're up in Churchill during the fall seasons, we can get a pretty good idea of how long the bears that we're seeing in the area, how long they've been on land, because we use what's called the sea ice breakup date. And that's determined when there's about 50% concentration of sea ice in the bay. And we can get that information from satellite imagery from climatologists or sea ice experts. And what we know about polar bear movement, once that habitat starts breaking up like that, where there's only about that 50% concentration, they're going to start heading back towards shore. They have that high site fidelity where they go back to where they were born, or they go back to where they're used to. And we know that from the satellite collars that we put on adult females. And so when that concentration is about 50%, the bears turn to shore. And then when they're on land, they're losing about 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds a day of their body fat when they're fasting. They might get some snack or some seal that washes up, but they really do fluctuate in their body weight. Depending on how good of a hunter that bear was, they can come on shore in June, July, and some males can be up close to 2,000 pounds. So the one thing I can't do super well with the photos is get an estimate of weight. I can get an estimate of like body size and approximately how thick like their fat might be, but we can't translate that into weight. We're looking into ways that we could do that, because that would be super useful, because then we could have a lot of ways of measuring their condition through the photos. But they can lose up to like 400, 500 pounds, just depending on how big they were when they came off, how long they're on shore. And so I think when I left Churchill on November 15th, they were still on shore. The ice didn't form until late November. And then that's another big area of questions for us as well, is how quickly do they start eating once they're on the ice? And that's something that with technology like using these satellite trackers and the radio collars, we're probably going to get a little bit more information about that. And I know that there's other graduate students that are looking to compare home ranges and like overlay the tracks to see, okay, well, most of the seals that we have tagged, are they in this area where bears that we also have tagged, are they there as well? And so when they're on land, they kind of space out and they're very solitary. They are a solitary species until it's like really close to that freeze up period. Then they all are really close to the shore, because they're all just so eager to get back out onto that sea ice. And that's what Churchill's really uniquely placed, in that we see polar bear interactions that in other areas of the Arctic, you probably wouldn't, like you might see a bear, but you're probably not going to see the types of social interactions that we see. When they're out on the sea ice, they're pretty, again, they spread out. The only ones that you really see together are family groups, like in the picture behind me was actually from 2 years ago, where we saw triplets for the first time in over a decade, because that's another thing that with the photographs, we're able to look at how many young the moms have, and do they have twins? Do they only have one? So we used to see twins all the time, and now it's a little bit more, we just often see a mom with a single. So when we saw triplets 2 years ago, it was really exciting. We didn't see the mom this year, like with her 2-year-old cubs. Doesn't mean that she's not there with all 3 of them. We hope that she is, but we can track things like that as well because they're coming ashore. And the amount of cubs that she has and how healthy the cubs look also give us a lot of indication to how well the eating was for them in the spring, how long were they out on that sea ice. And so as soon as we have that breakup date, then we'll start kind of like that fasting tracker. And there are thresholds, and 180 days is when we will start to see big population declines through some energetic modeling from people at the University of Alberta and the University of Toronto. We know if bears are fasting more than 180 days, it's most likely that it's just unsustainable for their body size, and that we will start to see population decline, mostly because the juvenile males and juvenile females. So these are polar bears that are 3 to 5 years old. They're no longer with their mom anymore. They're learning the sea ice. They're not that great yet. They're not sexually mature. Probably are the ones that we're going to see have those declines, just 'cause they don't know their environment. They're not as good of hunter. Like they're not as, I don't want to say lucky, but like they just don't have that experience. And so though that fasting threshold, I think, is an important one to keep in mind. And they are fasting typically almost 2 weeks longer than two decades ago. Yes, a great question. I'm just turning back to the chat about can we identify individuals through photographs? There is a researcher, actually, she's here at the University of Manitoba. She is not my personal research supervisor. My supervisor works with fisheries and oceans, Dr. Steve Ferguson, but Dr. Jane Waterman has worked with PBI in the past, and she's continuing where she uses cameras to take a photo of like the muzzle area, and she's looking at the whisker spot pattern as a form of identification. And that can, with that, we can then of course figure out who's who, and then also track some of their body condition from year to year. So that's something that I know is being developed and further researched. And again, doing this in Churchill, we have so many bears, and that with that site fidelity, it gives a lot of opportunity to develop these types of techniques that can then go and serve other areas in the Arctic where we can't do the type of research that we're able to in Churchill, because either it's unsafe for the bears, unsafe for humans, just inaccessible. Of course, nothing will replace the actual handling of a bear. That we're really quick. We try to get all these measurements within half an hour, but we get so much information. Just think about, like, for yourself, like if you go to the doctor and your doctor asks you all these questions, of course, bears don't respond to us, but we're able to get a lot of that kind of information. Having a photograph is good for baseline, and we can extrapolate what we learn about the Western Hudson Bay area to other areas of the Arctic. But it's really something that I'm really proud of that Polar Bears International also highly supports, is just this development of non-invasive methods that we can then go and use in other areas of the Arctic so that we can get more information in areas that are data lacking. The next question I see is, do they usually give birth to 2 cubs? It often, I think it's 2. Pretty twins are I think the majority of the cubs that we see come out of the dens in the Wapusk National Park area. So this is just east of Churchill. It does vary between polar bear populations, but I think the average and right now is like 1.6 cubs are born for each female, with this subpopulation, and that's gone down a little bit. It used to be, I think, closer to 2, just meaning that more twins were surviving, or in some cases, females were also giving birth to triplets. So I think that's all the questions I see in the chat.
So does anybody have any last questions for Cassandra here before we let her go?
Oh, hi, Cassandra. I have a question about the insulation quality of the fur.
Mhm.
I read something about you couldn't use thermal heat sensors because they were too insulated.
Like for polar bear research, you mean?
Right.
Yeah, I think there's, with the collars, and there's so much new research going into types of sensors that we can give or put on polar bears. I know less about the thermal sensors, because that is something that we've been able to do with seals and whales a little bit more easily. With bears, I think it's been a tricky balance, because as much as I would love to have passed this around so you could feel how light it actually is, the collars for bears feel really heavy. But then if you put it into perspective of this is a 1,000-pound animal, there's this delicate ratio. You don't want to make those collars, and this is true for any wildlife tagging, you don't want the device to be past a certain weight or proportion of their body weight. And I think some of those sensors are a little bit more like they weigh a little bit more. And then as you're mentioning too, like, I'm not an expert in it, but I think that it was also that they weren't reading, like we couldn't get the readings we needed efficiently with the collars, because that's how we would put on other sensors. We can put sensors on like accelerometers, and we were getting data about how quickly they're moving around, instead of just like I guess like a location point every 4 hours, which is usually what those collars are set to. But with new technology advances, we've developed, and when I say we, I mean the entire scientific community. I'm not involved in all of this, but there's these ear tags. So the device is much smaller, and we've been able to put it in the ear instead of it being a collar. And why that's important is it's allowed researchers to put this on bears of all sizes, because we've traditionally only been able to collar female bears because of their neck size. Male necks are way too large. So all he would have to do is just put his head down, and then the collar would come off, and those collars are around $3,000 depending on the device, and we would get no data. We don't want to collar a young growing bear, because we want the collar to stay snug, but we also don't want it to be too snug on a growing bear. So with these ear tags, we're able to improve technology. Maybe we in the future will be able to develop other sensors that will get more information, like some thermoregulation capabilities or other things that we've been able to track in other animals. And what's even more non-invasive or exciting is Polar Bears International has also worked with 3M, the company that makes tape. So they're good at sticking things to things. And so they worked with 3M to develop fur tags, and some of them, the prototypes look like tape. Other of them, like, they use these other mechanisms to hold on to the individual. So with that, those improvements I'm sure in the future we're going to see more types of sensors being placed onto polar bears so that we can learn more. We've just, I think up until now, been very limited with that we were only using a collar, and then also only on female adults.
I think we're going to wrap it up. We're well past your your time there. Thank you for dedicating so much time to us, Cassandra. That was super interesting.
Can Can we,
There's, oh, go ahead, Kate.
sorry, can we unmute and give her a clap? I mean, it just seems, you know.
Yeah, let's do that in about
Okay,
1
thank
second here.
Okay.
The one thing that I'll get from Cassandra and share with you guys is some links to like Polar Bear International website and other websites that are super interesting. And Polar Bears International is completely donation driven, so not a plug, but you know, it's a great cause to if you got a little extra cash to send their way, because it's very useful information. So and yeah, so let's open it up here, Emily, and we can give Cassandra a hand here.
Yay, thank you.
Thank you.
Favorite
Oh, where'd
hand.
Emily go? She must have left.
Thanks. Thanks.
Jeez.
Well, thank